Excellent. So today we're going to have a conversation. This is, for me, quite exciting. I myself have been a climate negotiator in the past. I won't reveal how long ago, but it was a bit. And it was always quite kind of curious, even intriguing, to understand how what is happening in those corridors have a relevance to what is happening outside of those corridors, and whether that that sort of situation of information flow that might not be super clear or might be unpredictable also replicates at the country level, in which you have actors of the real economy, civil society, private sector, that are doing stuff on the ground, but might not have the channels to connect with the public actors in their countries. So we're going to try to, mimic a bit of that here in real time by having a conversation between different actors from the public and private sector, and with that we'll, see how that goes. I have no clue on how that's going to come out, but we'll try. And we are. I just wanted to take you in a journey for a second. Raju, please. So this idea of having public and private actors in the space of negotiations started about 3 years ago. The high-level champions from the UK and Egypt asked a set of conveners to figure out ways in which we can bring together private actors and public actors. And so we started the process of having conversations to better understand the expectations and realities from each of those actors across the board, both climate negotiators, particularly climate finance negotiators, and private financial sector. And so what we started doing on that is to understand better a couple of things. The first one was, what is the private sector doing already on adaptation? How they are thinking of making adaptation investments investable with returns, on the one hand. The other was to try to understand what was the perception and understanding from the public side on what the private sector was doing. And finally, what the private sector would like to get off the public side for them to come in with even further investments. What are the kind of market signals that they needed from the governments? So we started that process, and we, in Dubai, 2 COPs ago, we launched the Call for Collaboration, which was an effort in which some of you were involved. The idea of the Call for Collaboration is to indicate that there is an opportunity to collaborate between these two set of actors, way beyond what so far we've been doing. And after a year in Baku, we launched a report that is 6 recommendations on how to scale up private sector investment on adaptation, which were looking into public mechanisms that could be advanced, such as national adaptation plans, for example, that could signal how the private sector could engage at multiple levels. So that takes us to today. Today we are in this panel. We're trying to replicate a bit of those conversations over time. And I will start with Martin. Martin, you're going to have to leave at some point. And I just wanted to pick your brain on how what is happening right now at COP in the negotiations around finance, particularly adaptation finance, but not only that. How is that evolving in line with what you were expecting? So what are you looking for? And broader, how that reflects on what you're trying to do outside of the negotiations. So what is the relationship between those two in your mind? And but we, this is intriguing for us. We are having a first-hand information from inside those halls from you. And Raju, I'll ask from you the same question. What's going on inside, and how that is meeting your expectations, and where that actually advances the efforts that you're doing outside of the negotiations for your countries.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me here. I think it's an extremely important question: adaptation finance, resilience finance, and what can we do? Maybe just to be very honest, I'm pretty new to the government. I have been 20 years in the private sector, research, NGOs, also private investments. So I have a bit of a different perspectives, maybe to other negotiators. So I'm sure you have much more to say on your actual question than me. But let me still try to say, I think for us as Switzerland, this COP is very important because it's the year of the NDCs. We have to take look where we are, how we can move forward. So we look for an ambitious outcome that both encompass obviously something on mitigation, that call for action, and obviously you have to do also more on adaptation and resilience. We have the global goal on adaptation here, and we have a lot of different discussions that relate to climate resilient investments or finance, both in the finance rooms on the funds, but also in relation to 1C, you know, the paragraph in the Paris Agreement that talks about alignment of financial flows with climate resilient and low carbon development. So for us, 1C is very important because we have to make overall progress, right? It's not just about money from developed to developing countries. It's also about the broader investment space. So we have to make progress there. There, I think we started slow. We still have some work to do, but I'm more optimistic than I was yesterday that we move forward. On the funds, I think we started to discuss, things are moving a bit ahead. I mean, we obviously hope a bit that there's a transition of the adaptation fund to the Paris Agreement, so I can access the money from Article 6.4, right? That's really key, I think, for many of us, and we have just some issues to resolve. And I really hope we have this, you know, constructive dialogue to move ahead. So, in terms of that, you know, also glass is half full, half empty, I would say. And finally, on global goals for adaptation, I have to say I hear only part of it, so maybe others have more information. It seems it has started well, but still a lot of work ahead of us. And to your second question, how this relates to what we do outside of COP, right? So it might not surprise you as a former private sector representative. For me, it's very important what happens outside, right? We're maybe as government sometimes a bit distant from what's the situation on the ground. You know, the farmers that have challenges with climate change, the private sector that thinks how can they incorporate resilience into their decision making and so on. So we have to think much more about that. So I think what we do here at COP is just setting the scene, hopefully raising some funds, making sure we have good architecture, but then we have to engage much more on the implementation side. I would say, even if we're very successful here, the real work actually only starts after COP, because then we have to implement, we have to engage with the private sector, we have to engage with NGOs and so on. We do a bit of it here, but I think you probably agree with me, my colleague, that we have very little time for that. So we need to take then the time after the COP to do all of these engagements. I'm looking forward to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. And I forgot to mention, you know, who are you? You are the climate finance lead negotiator for the government of Switzerland here at COP30, correct?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
Yeah. So let me move to Raju. Raju, the same question from your perspective. If I ask you, you know, even to make it more concrete, and Jimena, I will pass to you with the same question, that it's Saturday morning of the second week, after we've hopefully reached gavel the COP decision and a set of our COP decisions, what would make you feel satisfied of the process as a result of these conversations around adaptation, around finance, coming from, again, your introduction, you are Nepal's climate negotiator lead, and so you have a broader vision as well of the whole process, and long time fellow in this process. So Raju, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jorge. Well, first of all, sorry that I got lost in this venue, because this is the first time I come to the pavilions, apart from the negotiating room. So I just made a lot of wrong turns here. Yes. Well, on the first of all, that there is a little expectation on the finance agenda item, like compared to what we had last year, because last year was the NCQZ time, right? So there was a big finance COP, that's how it was portrayed. But this time it is more shared on implementation. But when you talk about implementation, when you focus on things like adaptation, of course, you cannot get away without talking about or having concrete elements decided on climate finance, and that becomes a very key part. So one of the things that you'll have noticed here in this COP30 is the LDC group has put out a call, and that has been supported by many other groups as well. It's the call to triple the adaptation financing and continue on the Glasgow decision that talked about doubling. So we have made a very clear call that by 2030, the tripling would be 120 billion by 2030 with a base year of 2025. So that's the ask. So that's on adaptation. And this is in relation to two elements. One, you'll see that it directly talks to the continuation of the Glasgow doubling and going forward, and in line with the 300 billion goal that we agreed last year. So in order to achieve balance between adaptation, mitigation, prioritizing, and because there's a reason why that doubling was made and to be in that line. The second part is that in the NCQZ decision on paragraph 16, it talks about tripling the outflows from the operating entities and the funds of the financial mechanism, right? So in that particular line, again, if we have that the target of $120 billion, that is expected also to input into these funds or the operating entities going forward. So we say this primarily because these funds are very dear to countries like LDCs and probably SIDS and other vulnerable countries where it prioritizes adaptation actions. Because in general terms, we have always seen very skewed focus on mitigation, like with a ratio of 1:5 when it comes to investments or the funding work on that. So in order to balance out that is where it comes. But of course, this 120 billion ask is just not on the public finance. Just to be clear to Martin as well, that this is like our part of the what do you call this 300 billion goal, but also is not all grants that is being sought here. But there are certain elements that we would like to prioritize grants over that because country like LDCs and others would be very difficult for them to take a loan. I say this and we'll bring it to the Nepal context is, for instance, we have been always saying, how will the private sector really come into play when it comes to adaptation? But then again, the country that I come from, where Martin is also a very mountainous country, in the Himalayas now, we're having many, mountain floodings. Even Switzerland just had this, I think earlier this year, a massive, giveaway from the glacier lakes. And we're having this almost every year. Villages are being lost, the downstream infrastructures are being lost, like hydropowers, or the roads, villages, agricultural land, everything is being washed away. Now, we don't see any private sector coming and getting engaged into that because there's just not that return for them to have that appetite in coming to that place. They don't see that. So they're more focused on the mitigation. So what we do see is now there's a little movement around insurance, so insuring agriculture products. Even in the high mountains that they have started insuring apples, for instance. I think that's a good start in a way, and there are a lot of other agricultural products as well. But again, the focus of the private sector on adaptation has been minimal, and this is the case for, also with many of the least developed countries, because that incentivization for the private sector to come in is not there. So if you are saying that no private sector for adaptation, we have to be very clear that there is no such thing as one size fits all. If it works in a certain country, it does not necessarily mean it works in others. So you'll have to have this very context-based, country-based, what is the enabling environments that they have, what are the incentivizing tools that the countries have really put in. That's a very key part. For instance, Nepal recently launched its green finance taxonomy. And one of the things is really encouraging how the private sector can come into climate actions, both on the adaptation and mitigation. I think this is a good tool. It's not mandatory, but it's very encouraging that if you do this, you might get this kind of low interest rates and things like that are coming. I think this is a good start. But if you expect that in adaptation, which is like managing flood risks or managing mountain glaciers or lowering glacier lakes in them, that is just not possible in that sense. So we'll have to be very practical in how we go for that. But of course, those things directly talk to our negotiations rooms. Because when we say raise on certain elements, we are talking about practical aspects from our countries that we want them to be reflected, of course, in a broader sense. So there's the incentivization. Who does that incentivization? If it's an insurance, who pays the premium for the premium for the farmers? Those are very critical questions that we'll have to keep asking and also moving forward in that particular line. So I will not get into a lot of details. You talk about the GJ, of course, the indicators will be there. We believe that they will be voluntary at the end, but if countries can report to them, they will do that based on those. But the countries should have the liberty to choose and work on what works best for them based on their particular context, because the choices of the island states or coastal countries could be very different to that of a country like ours, which is a landlocked and a mountainous country. Right? So that's why I say one size does not fit all is in that particular context as well. So I will end there in that general, but thank you for the invitation again.
Of course, Ryu, thank you so much. Hiben, I'm going to go to you, but right before going to you, just wanted to get a bit of a conversation going here. So, Martin, I'm not sure at what time you need to leave. You have a couple of more minutes, or
Maybe 5.
maybe 5. So, on the one size fits all, there is a whole international process, like this multilateral process, that is trying to understand how different countries, in the real economy, interact with the private sector. There are some countries in which capital markets are more advanced, and others not that much. How do you see this process responding to that reality? There are countries like LDCs, there are countries like emerging economies like Peru. So again, not one size fits all. How do you see that this being reflected here that could actually respond to that reality out there? Private sector is great, but the playing field is not leveled across the world.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I would actually, respond a lot to what you said, right? I think adaptation is a very local or, context-driven activity, and one fits. I would say one size doesn't fit all. I would totally support that. So, I mean, where we are here at the negotiations, it's a very high level. It's at the end very distant to the real world, right? So we just have to create the infrastructure that different approaches in different fields are possible. So if we take a concrete activity, obviously we will always look for first, can the private sector come in? Can the private sector finance it? What are the barriers, the risks we address, right? So that will be our approach, particularly also domestically in Switzerland, right? As we have a very strong insurance sector, finance sector, but also our farmers, right? They will need additional information. So we'll work what we can do and what we have to do as a complement to support as a government. And for instance, right now we work a lot on data gathering, making sure the data is available to the private sector. In the end, probably information capacity building is the best thing you can do, because in the end, it's not the government who will take the right decisions. It will be the individual person, the farmers, the companies, right? But they need the right information. That's what we do. And internationally, we hope, every country has to do the same, right? Depending on its national circumstances. And it's very clear that obviously we'll have to support some countries, particularly the poorest countries, those who are most vulnerable, right? And we're ready to do that through different adaptation finance means, and we have to think about how can we do it better, and to make sure the money really lands where it's best used. You may have heard about this very controversial decision for us to reject the recent project in Oman. It comes up almost in every negotiation room, right? But we are very honest, it was not a decision against Oman or anything like, where they are in the world. It was really like we thought that the GCF, according to the guidelines it has, can spend or has to spend the money more effectively, right? We would have loved to see more private sector capital coming in, a reflow, and not just grants, and also reflecting, obviously, the income status. So this is important to us. We have limited means, and we have to be also honest as a developed country. We have scarce means, right? There's a big fight for our budget, right? Every dollar I have to get domestically for the parliament is very difficult, right? And if all the money that we have in these fantastic climate funds, the GCF, the adaptation funds, LDCF, SCCF, all important, means we have to be very careful that we spend it as most effectively as possible. But yes, it will not be us top-down deciding how we do it. It will come bottom-up, right? So that's what I can say about that. I hope we answered your question.
Yeah, that's certainly one way in which the system has, built that capacity of creating operating entities that could actually reflect that reality with the with the mechanisms and the rules that those operating entities work around. Jimena, what would be an ideal outcome from where you see it as Peru coming out of this COP on adaptation finance and finance in general, adaptation finance in particular? What would you like to see, and go back to Lima and say, we're victorious, we won?
Thank you, Jorge. And sorry for being late. I'm familiar with this place, but I was closing another meeting. Okay, I think the most important thing is when we're talking about Peru, we are trying to for private sector, not only the projects that will be focused in adaptation, but also in mitigation. They are not very familiar with these issues. I mean, when you're talking about negotiation, it's so far away from what business people is thinking about there. So we are perhaps in a very, very beginning of this, and trying to be clear about how they action, how this business can be connected with climate action in terms of mainly with adaptation, benefits on adaptation and mitigation. We are trying to show them there are signals from the global world, from the negotiation, and try to show you that, okay, there are going to be some financial flows, and they will be close to you at some points, and trying to inject more energy and try to mobilize this in Peru as well. So actually we are just finishing our financial strategy, national financial strategy in Peru. It will be a very important policy instrument because it will be endorsed for many, many sectors in Peru. And we are started with trying to set all the opportunities for this private sector and how these opportunities match with them and the private with private funds, public funds and corporation funds as a trigger for go further. So for us, the important outcome from this moment is this kind of signal that, okay, this is this kind of thing that we are trying to promote from the ministry, from the government. It has it's supporting with it's not only for us, and for sure that the operational, as you mentioned as well, the productivity that will be is supported by the UNFCCC, by the negotiation, and by the rules, clear rules. The productivity of the funds are there for this, because in Peru we are in the very early stage, so they need to be clear that we be okay. This is a pathway, a very good pathway to go forward, to contribute, and perhaps to develop more projects that are contributing or that are already contributed, and at the moment in adaptation issue, that's our priority for sure in Peru.
Jimena, thank you very much. Martin, thanks for having us, for being with us. So let me turn now to the private sector. So you've heard about a couple of important things. There's a whole system that has been built around deciding how the financial support is going to be looked for. It's going to be channeled towards countries that tries to recognize the difference between developing countries, some more advanced in terms of capital markets, others not that much, some with access to finance in ways that others might not have, and so the role of the private sector differs depending on those realities. What would you if you were sitting in front of a ministry, of environment, what would you ask? What would you, ask as a possibility of and understanding better how you can connect the private sector, your work, with those actors? And if I can ask just one more question is, what would be helpful from you sit that should come out of this process? What are the kind of signals that will be helpful on your day-to-day work to further mobilize your actions from the private side into the public space? So Anjali, let me start with you. You've been doing some interesting work around NAPs, National Adaptation Plans. And so maybe in that context, you can respond a bit of what you heard from Nepal and Peru. And Anjali works at the Asian Investors Group on Climate Change. So Anjali, the floor is yours.
Can you hear me? Is this good? Yeah, okay. I think where we are at in terms of adaptation finance from how the private sector is looking at it it's evolved quite a lot. There's been significant amount of progress that we need to sort of recognize. This sort of comes from the fact that there's better data, better assessments being done of the private sector in terms of the exposure of their existing investments to physical climate risk exposure. So specifically, I just wanted to sort of throw out some numbers just to sort of give everyone a sense of why the private sector is taking it so seriously and really wants to see action on it as well. So one of our members, we work with 80 plus institutional investors that have exposure to Asian markets, and Asian markets are at risk to climate, right? So one of our members, GIC, which is one of Singapore's sovereign wealth funds, they did an assessment of the real estate investment trust, so like the REIT index, which is run by S&P. So they found that by 2050, 89% of the assets on the REIT index will be exposed to climate hazards, which is exposing them to around 500 billion USD in terms of losses. That's one number. We're doing a similar assessment across different other sectors. The utility sector, the numbers are similar. If you do not act now, the cost for you in the next decade, the next 2 decades, 3 decades is going to be manifold. There's, apart from asset level risk, there's also better risk data that's coming in terms of the impact that it would have on people and workforce. In Singapore, where I am based, there's an assessment that's done on the increasing heat stress and the impacts that it would have on workforce productivity. So in Singapore, which is a country that's already exposed to heat stress, the workforce productivity impact it has per day is USD $21 per worker. And this is in a sector where they do not have to make like big decisions. It's smaller, sort of like, the majority of the workforce in Singapore. But when you actually quantify that in a year, it's around USD 2.2 billion workforce productivity that's impacted by heat stress. And so the thing is that now a lot of this climate risk has been translated into financial risk, which incentivizes the finance sector to think about ways that they can actually respond to these risks. And I think just in terms of finance flows to support adaptation and resilience, it has been growing. If you look at the climate policy initiative numbers on adaptation and resilience by the private sector, to emerging markets and developing economies, it's doubled over the last 5 years. And I honestly feel like the tracking of adaptation and resilience financing is not done adequately, because adaptation and resilience is actually, it's quite a big bucket. And the thing is that a lot of the companies across Asian markets that are already exposed to year-on-year risk, they're already allocating their capital to addressing climate hazards. A lot of these are acute risks, because that's what you're sort of seeing year on year, like the heat stress related risks, the flooding related risks. But that's also preparing companies, it's preparing investors to think more long term, which means that you're actually now thinking about chronic risk planning, which is resilience planning, right? And bringing that to the market. I think there's also some really interesting data that's come out quite recently. It shows that the market is also responding to climate hazards impacting companies that are not prepared for risks. you see actually a downfall in the pricing of a company in days before they are actually exposed to landslides, the days that they are, in the days that they are exposed to flooding. So I just wanted to bring all of this out there because it sort of shows the real incentive for why the private sector really wants to sort of do more on adaptation. Just amongst the 80 plus financial institutions that we work with that represents 35 trillion, most of them are focusing on how to address the adaptation gaps in their existing companies, but also thinking about future investments, like how do you look at diligence processes to ensure that you're investing in regions that are resilient. I think all of these are sort of really important factors to consider, and this is where it comes to the national adaptation plans, right? A lot of the responses that you're seeing in the market by investors, companies are very responsive to immediate climate hazards. But we need to actually work towards systemic resilience for economies that not just thinks about long-term business productivity, but like how do you think about climate resilience that works for an entire market, the people, and how can actually businesses contribute towards that and finance be a part that private sector can contribute to. And that's why we started focusing on national adaptation plans. We think it's a very crucial document that's able to bring together different perspectives of stakeholders and actually show the direction on what do you need to sort of see in the market. Very clear, very similar to like the transition planning process that we sort of embarked on many years back, right? You need a clear direction towards what you're working towards in the long term that sends signals to companies in terms of how much heat stress are we working towards? How much water-related flooding risks will this market be exposed to? That sort of sends signals that we need to think about infrastructure, we need to think about services, we need to think about products that will actually build market-level resilience. But it also gives companies the foresight on sort of the demand for these products as well, right? Which is where business actually flourish. You need more certainty that if you invest in resilience today, there is going to be a market for that tomorrow as well. And so that's really where the National Adaptation Plan comes in. We put out quite simple 7 expectations from the investor sector on how can you enhance the National Adaptation Plans to make sure the private sector is able to play a clearer role in terms of achieving those outcomes. It starts with things like, consistent views of, national level risk on adaptation, putting out scenario analysis that sort of enables you to think about multiple scenarios that you need to factor in case you're operating in a 1.5 degree aligned work, or if it's sort of more moderate to high risk, what would that world really look like? And consequent to that, to develop an adaptation plan in terms of sectoral planning. Like if you need to sort of think about health sector resilience, infrastructure resilience, what does that really look like? And then to translate that into different types of projects and services that's required in that market. And that's really what would give investors, companies that clarity on how can you actually work on it together. And I feel like for this concept of adaptation, collaboration is more important than any of us really realize, because the scale to which markets are going to be exposed to climate hazards is something that none of us are prepared for. And we can't actually continue to operate in these silos in terms of thinking about water risks as being separate to people-centric risks, being separate to adaptation, infrastructure. All of this really needs to come together in terms of better planning and stakeholder interaction to be able to do that, which is why we sort of embarked on the investor-led engagement on the adaptation planning process. So there's a bit more clarity to policymakers on how can you actually at the start work towards something that will attract capital in these markets.
Anjali, thank you so much. This was fascinating in terms of how private sector is looking at this and how real it is for them in that region. When we set out this conversation, I knew that I was going to take a big risk because negotiators are usually, unpredictably called into different rooms. So unfortunately, Jimena is going to have to leave us, as well as Martin did. So that's a risk that I take responsibility because it's always that case. Brad, you know this better than anybody else. How unpredictable are the negotiations. But we're really glad that you can have some more time with us. So, Shershi, you from Zurich International, you are looking into how you can build bridges between your set of actors, your base of clients and customers, and seeing how the public sector space could also play a role on, similar to what Anjali was saying, sending market signals, creating that market in a way that allows for actors like yours to land in different geographies. Can you a bit, share with us what are you thinking of what would be an ideal scenario of signals coming from this process that will help on that effort?
Thank you. Struggling with the extreme heat that we have right here. No, I'm actually really glad to hear, it was really encouraging to hear some of the discussions that are happening in the negotiations and a couple of things that are going on and how we could link some of our capabilities. You mentioned the word insurance. I mean, Nepal, you've been very aware of the value of insurance capabilities in terms of climate risk modeling, how to embed that, but also how to reduce the risks that you're faced with, be it at a country level, be it with infrastructure projects, and how do you bring that down. So as an insurance company, that's basically what we can strive for. We want to make sure that people are aware in terms of the insurance capabilities that are out there, that we're not just seen as the provider of insurance cover. I mean, we do that, but that is at the tail end of what we call the value chain. And we are in a situation where there's increasing, more frequent and more unpredictable climate hazards happening. So the question of affordability is then very, very key. And this is at an individual level as at a sovereign level, because we know that nations are also struggling with budgets. There's limited resources. How do you allocate those resources to the best effective way within your country? And insurance, with its rising premiums, which serve as the risk signal of the underlying exposure, is becoming harder and harder to finance if it's already integrated in the national plans. And that is something we need to work on. So we need to also make sure that we can bring down the risk exposure by advising also on the risk reduction and risk prevention measures that can be taken with the know-how and expertise that we have. And by doing that, we can then enable an environment where insurers are more likely to be able to stay to underwrite the risks, but also for investors to come in and help and increase their investment allocations in resilience and adaptation measures or infrastructure projects or whatever it may be. At the same time, from a private sector, we also need to make sure that all of these solutions are done with a commercial long-term financial sustainability as well. And then that would be kind of our ask as well, our expectation when we have these conversations is that there's acknowledgement, just like you need to maintain a financial budget, we also need to maintain a financial budget. And so we need to make sure that we develop solutions that are long-term commercially sustainable. And we can work together to do this and advocate then for that public-private partnership. One example I want to give in terms of how we managed to do that is specifically in Germany. I know it's a developed country, but we have the flood issues, severe flood issues there as well. Is we worked with the public, and this is more to your question as well, we worked with a corporation. They had a production facility, hundreds of millions of losses because of flooding. We worked with them to understand what their real exposures are, how they could actually reduce the risks. And of course, it required engaging with the municipality and railway provider in the region to be able to understand how they can work together to invest in risk reduction measures so that it protected everyone in that area. And we outlined the plan for them, and I'm happy to say they did invest. Each counterpart and stakeholder around the table invested in risk reduction measures. And then the next flood came from the commercial client perspective. They suffered only a couple of million losses. So it was a huge, huge drop. And this in relative to relatively minimal investments in risk reduction. But they had to do this in collaboration with the public stakeholders around the table. And then not to mention then the social impacts that were mitigated as a result of that. So if I were to ask, I think one of the questions that you were looking at as well is what would be our ask to, when we're working, when you're in that room, is to make sure that there's also a call and a recognition that insurance can play a role in national adaptation strategies, national finance strategies. It's not the silver bullet, but as part of a layered financing mechanism, it certainly can play a role. And we saw that in Jamaica just recently as well, the impact that can have. But also to make sure that risk data and resilience insights are also embedded into the national adaptation plans. because you cannot afford to build with yesterday's risks understanding and risk exposures. We can look at climate risk assessments for infrastructure planning, land use zoning, building codes, regulations, and also to help inform how to allocate those really scarce resources within your region. And secondly, or thirdly actually, incorporate resilience into blended finance frameworks. Because we do want to invest in resilience and adaptation measures. We need to find a way that we can do it so we can actually incorporate returns from it. We've seen a lot of examples where governments, municipalities are coming out with resilience bonds, where they're actually funding the returns on those, and the investors love these kind of projects because they understand where the returns are coming from. They understand also where the proceeds are going to. But when we're investing in those assets, we also need to make sure that we're thinking about resilience in and of itself of those projects, so that those infrastructure assets are done and built according to future scenarios of what could potentially happen, and understanding then also the impact on the wider ecosystem and people surrounding that infrastructure asset. There's an opportunity here for governments to start thinking about this and embedding it in those discussions. As risks increase, actions to reduce risk need to be incorporated. We need to limit those losses. And insurance can play a role in that, in understanding the risk, managing it, but also helping advise how to allocate and reduce the risks. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, certainly it did, and opened more questions in my mind. I want to turn to Raju. Give us a sense of, one thing is to have, you put a very important point before, that is, who pays for it? Yeah, it's a mechanism that is there. You can, reallocate those, transfer that risk to capital markets. Capital markets will pay for it, 5, 10, 15, 20 times. That's a promise. And that's the opportunity. But somebody needs to pay for that premium, and you need to create that mechanism. That's a question that I would like to dig a bit deeper in terms of how you're thinking about that, because at the end of the day, it's a mechanism. It's not a silver bullet, but it's a mechanism. But I just wanted to ask you also, on top of that, in addition to the money is not everything. There is also a need for capacity. How do you build? How do you install additional capacity in your government to be able to get that information, process that information, set out the plans that will allow for both public finance mechanisms that could be supported by international public cooperation, but also opportunities to engage with private financial mechanisms would work. So, what would be your ask if we were put in front of not only the resources, as you mentioned in the process, but also capacities that you will need in this real world, in your real world of a public sector actor?
Yeah. Yes, thank you very much. Well, if you look into this process, it's well designed in a way to say that, of course, if you give the money and if you don't have the capacity, how will you use that money is always a question, right? But the way it is designed is just not about money. First, we say what do we want to do. We have plans like within NDCs or NAPs or whatever plan, or the country prioritized plans themselves. The second part is, in this process, when you talk about the finance, we also talk together with it the capacity building and the technology part. So those all three are in a combined set of means of implementation. So in order to really move that action forward, that you will not just need finance, but also the technology and capacity building. Of course, the different countries, again, have different capacity to really absorb or really utilize or plan or see that future. But what is certain is, even now, many of the developing countries are already paying their own loss and damage or adaptation needs. Whether the international community gives or not, they're already doing. It's the responsibility, obligation of the government to respond to their own capacity to all these extreme events going on the ground. I mean, like in Nepal, like if a person's house goes away, they get $500, $5,000 per household in the mountains. There's a different ones for mountains, hills, and plains. So that's by obligations that in order to support immediate support for the citizens. But what is for sure is under this mechanism, which is the rights of the developing countries to reserve resources, receive resources, if this money that was agreed here, or under the financial mechanism that is agreed here, if that was delivered to the countries, that would help them a lot in not taking away the resources from their education, health, infrastructure, other needs, so that they can respond to the climate extremes. And as you provide resources, of course, the resources is also going to, alongside, build the capacity, build the institutional capacity, build the absorption capacity, investment capacity. All this capacity comes along with it. So it's not like that because you don't have capacity that we will not provide resources. The first thing is to really say that when countries are demanding on projects or programs, the resources must be provided. I think that's what. If you look at the very design fund like adaptation fund or the LDCF or other funds, one of the component under that is also preparedness and readiness support, preparatory and readiness support. This is that if in order to write a funding proposal or a program and then to implement that, they also have support system for building your capacity along with it. So now in this context, they will have to make utilization of the resources so the capacity is really enhanced. But I do take your point that sometimes that this is becoming a conditionality, not to provide resources, not to provide technology, because you don't have the capacity. Why do you need resources? But this does not match with the vulnerability, with the extreme events, with the adaptation need. The loss and damage is on the ground. So of course, countries are going to make mistakes because for many of the governments, addressing climate change is a new thing. They have been so used to doing DRR. Now, if you look at the context of loss and damage, they're supposed to be addressing both the economic and non-economic losses. That is just not about responding to the DRR activities, but pre-planning it, looking to the future, looking at the non-economic aspects that we have not seen in the past. People having to migrate, people having to leave their cultural aspects. And so there are varieties of aspects. So in addressing those, people are going to make mistakes, but the capacity is going to be enhanced. You implement, you learn, you not repeat that again, right? So that's the process of going forward. And this, the providing resources should not be a conditionality to say that you don't have the enabling environment, you don't have the capacity, you cannot address this. I think those excuses we see it as excuse not to provide resources to these developing countries on what has been agreed under this. So we would like to see that NCQG decision that was last year that talks about the access issue. If you just go there, it's about not just having the quantum side, but also the access element, the qualitative side. We know that there is a gap in access because of the capacity issue. It needs to be addressed that. I think we have to see that as a package in terms of allowing countries to make mistakes, learn from it, and address those gaps that the countries have.
That's an excellent answer. Thank you so much for just putting it so clear and so real. So let me put you both, Anjali and Sergio, on a very difficult spot. So with that reality, what can the private sector do?
Can I go?
Again, there is a lack of financial resources. So it's not that, you will wait for somebody to pay the private sector to do it. So in that reality, in that setup, what the private sector can do in real terms. So Sergio and then Anjali.
So at this point, I think it's fair to mention the Insurance Development Forum because I take your point. I think that's, you have to learn through the process. You have to learn through trying different projects. So Insurance Development Forum, for those who are not aware, is a public-private partnership founded by the World Bank, UNDP, and the insurance industry. And it was in that recognition that we have capabilities and expertise that we can bring to support building climate resilience in vulnerable countries. And part of that is capacity building, because we know sometimes it's not clear what is it that we can provide in terms of expertise, how can that help? So we work with countries on different projects to help develop insurance solutions that would help them. But key is that we're working with the countries to do that, because through that process, you build the capacity that is needed. One of the other things that we've started to do with the World Bank is the World Bank has started to get government representatives, usually from the Ministry of Finance, together with the insurance industry so that we can help outline the insurance value chain, if you will. So understanding the importance of risk modeling, how that can inform decisions at a national level, but also some of the challenges that come out of that and what would be needed. What is needed for a regulatory environment? What can we provide in terms of risk reduction measures and advice, and what can we actually do and not do in terms of insurance solutions? And through that process, help build awareness really at a ministerial level of the role that insurance can and cannot play in increasing resilience of that thing. Because it cannot be, like you said, that you wait for capacity to be there before the solution gets developed or the financing happens. So that's really important for us to do that. And then through that process, increase the learning. And also understanding the risks and how you can actually reduce them then enables then capital flows to actually then start to come in, because that's then the other side of the angle. As investors, we can also support. But for that to happen, we need to understand really what the return component is from those investments. How do we are diversifying the individual projects that come up around resilience, how we are diversifying the risks of those, how that income is being generated. One of the things that we, as IDF, launched as well, and it's not easy, but we've attempted with this first infrastructure development fund, resilient development fund. It was created by insurers for insurers to invest. And the reason why we did that is because people came to us and said, can you invest in resilient infrastructure in emerging markets? And of course we're like, no, there's too many hurdles, we can't do it. So we said, okay, let's sit down together and create a fund that would meet our requirements, that supports resilient infrastructure investment in emerging economies. And we've done that. We selected a partner. BlackRock is the asset manager for this fund, and we've got first close of the fund as well. IFC has also come on board and is investing alongside us as well. And we made sure that as part of the criteria for investing to enable those long-term sustainable returns to be generated, that we looked at resilience in two ways, which I touched upon before, but it's worth being explicit about it in this context. One is that the investments that were made, the infrastructure investments that are coming through the pipeline are resilient in and of themselves. So they will be there in 50 years' time. So we can make sure that the income from those investments will continue to stay, which is an important part of an investor. You need to have that return security or income security. And the second one is that the outcome is also resilient. So it's helping build resilient communities around it. And I think this is a good way that we've been able to create something that we hope will really, it's a blended finance structure. It's created for insurers by insurers. It addresses some of the challenges that small and medium infrastructure investors in emerging markets face. And we hope it can serve as a blueprint for others to come in so that you can, as a private sector, we can help build resilience as an investor. And from the previous example, we also build it in terms of capacity and insurance solutions.
Sergey, thank you so much. Very clear, specific solutions. Anjali, bring us home. We are, the next couple of minutes, and with that, we'll close the panel. What can you do from where you sit, without waiting for others to give signals? Where do you start?
So, I think because as AIGCC, we are trying to operate across so many Asian markets. Each of them are sort of quite unique. The way that I try to frame it in my mind, like when we're trying to sort of solve these unique challenges across so many multiple markets, is essentially like you're playing like a game of multi-dimensional chess, if you think about it. So like the international outcomes that you're thinking about is right at the top. There's the national level circumstances in which each country operates with, like in terms of like their geopolitical risks, their own development sort of aspects, their access to capital issues, and there's the real economy sector at the bottom, which is the companies, the financial sector that's operating in all of these systems that's hopefully working towards getting those international outcomes together. But the problem is that each of these layers operates within its own set of rules. And that's not difficult, that's not easy to change overnight. It takes time. So you have to try and figure in the rule system that you're operating in currently, how best can you like work towards serving what you're trying to meet at the national level so that you meet the international level. So I think fundamentally for the private sector, I think the question is how do we actually primarily enable the private sector to invest in developing economies, underdeveloped markets more as a first step towards thinking about how do you actually then think about scaling adaptation finance. And that's a project that AIGCC is really trying to undertake, like trying to change the risk perceptions that investors have in terms of investing in emerging markets, developing economies, underdeveloped markets, sort of trying to show them that a lot of it is perceived risks. Like you can sort of start building portfolios in emerging markets, developing economies that are similar to the portfolios that you're building in developed markets and actually move away from some of these perceived risks. First, think about like bringing access to capital to these markets. And once the capital starts flowing, it will have, dimensions of like resilience, because you're seeing that a lot of markets are exposed to adaptation and you want to sort of see those measures. So private capital will flow. So I think if you sort of start solving some of these structural barriers, which are sort of quite fundamental to getting to that level, you will sort of, be there. And that's what AIGCC is trying to do. And I think a lot of these conversations, like we're all going back to those sort of same issues. There are some structural issues that we need to address today so that these goals on adaptation, goals on mitigation across the world will be sort of achieved. And during that process, we're actually seeing some good models that's already being able to leverage private capital to go into developing economies, underdeveloped markets. Like one good example that I've been highlighting throughout the COP process is AIIB has been issuing resilience bonds. It sort of works towards deploying that capital towards meeting resilience needs of developing, underdeveloped Asian markets, looking at flooding risks that they have. And these types of bonds are heavily over-invested by investors. A lot of our investors have invested in it. It's like a USD 500 million fund that they issued 2 years back, but they've been subsequently issuing it again and again because there's market demand. It's working to sort of meet the needs of the market by guaranteeing sort of like the returns. So there's already sort of small steps being taken to reach there, but like we need to actually think about what's the bigger picture that we're working towards, and can we sort of think about systemically changing the way that capital actually thinks about risks and going into markets.
Anjali, thank you so much for that very concrete example. And with that, we'll close the panel. Very, very much appreciate your time, your insights, your willingness to play this game in terms of connecting and trying to understand what others are needing, and get in the other people's shoes and be present. So thank you again, Shershi, Anjali, and Raju for your presence, and Martin and Jimena who were there here and had to leave early. Much appreciated.